Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
The views, assumptions, and opinions expressed by the Geo Godfather hosts, guests, and callers on the program are strictly their own and do not necessarily represent the opinions or beliefs of Electricast Media.
I've said for a long time now, for about 10 years, since Robert Gates started to talk about how much the United States subsidizes NATO, the fact that in the past, the Americans, whenever there was a problem in the world, would say, look, we're going to form a posse and we're going to hand out the deputies' badges. You and I call it a coalition. We go and sort it out and then we go back again. Well, what the Americans are saying now is unless you actually invest in your own defense and security in Europe, in the Middle East, or in the Asia Pacific, that posse ain't going to be formed. But if you do invest in your own defense, we will send the cavalry.
Welcome to the Geo Godfather Wars, the real talk on understanding how geopolitics impacts you and your world. We're your hosts,
Barack Sina,
and I'm Leah Tedrow. Thank you for joining us as we take a deep dive behind the topics affecting the world we live in today. Welcome back to the show, where we'll be discussing whether we're on the brink of World War III and the convergence of Russia, Iran, and China. Later on the show, we'll be joined by our special guest, retired British Royal Navy Rear Admiral Christopher Parry, CBE, former NATO Commander, and the first chair of the British government's Marine Management Organization. He'll be discussing the current state of the world and the prospect of future conflict with the major geopolitical players and the altering state of play globally. Our usual segments of what this means to you and who's who in The Godfather, where Barack will discuss which countries are emulating the traits of the characters from The Godfather, will follow. And so with that, let's get started. Barack, how are you?
Fine, how are you doing?
I'm good. I'm recovering from kind of a week of insanity. As you know, here in the UAE, we were hit with like an insane storm last week. And we had 10 inches of rain in 24 hours, which is the same as 2 years of rain for us. And it's just caused chaos. We've had mass floodings. We've had roads disappear. We've had flight cancellations. I think Emirates said it was behind by about 400 flights. And the videos are crazy of just like flights landing in what looks like a lake at Dubai airport and stuff. So it's been just crazy trying to get everything, back to normal, really. So luckily we were not as affected where we are, but there's just been, whole homes.
Yeah.
You
cope. It's probably like being in lockdown again, isn't it?
But yeah, so we've got a pretty full-packed show this week, if I'm honest. And we have the most amazing guest, which we'll get into a little bit later, who I was like, we could have spoken to him for hours, really.
I know.
You're amazing.
He's an intellectual heavyweight. And I just think it is important because of that to actually use our segment to prepare for him, because what he describes is not simply international affairs and geopolitical dynamics. He actually offers the prisms for us to view the world as well, which I think is pretty essential. And I think that it would be important for us to expound upon those prisms now.
The last few episodes, we've been talking about conflict. Specifically, we started off talking about the Ukraine and what was going on there. We've talked extensively about what's happening in Israel and Gaza. And then recently we've had, Iran wading in there. So we have this convergence of sort of Russia, China, and Iran. And things are moving at a very strange pace. If you look at where we are with the Ukraine right now, we've got France wanting to wade in and bring NATO troops and go into the Ukraine, which, I think everyone has said that's insane to do that, to invite issues to happen, because if NATO soldiers are injured or wounded, or there's an attack on a NATO country, that's a whole nother level. That's war in Europe. Widespread NATO will have to intervene. So me personally, I think that's crazy. And I think everybody else has kind of come to that conclusion too, and told France to calm down and to not want to do that. Then you've got what's happened recently in Israel with Iran attacking Israel after the 1 April strike on the Iranian diplomatic compound in Damascus, which hit a diplomatic building and took out the highest ranking Iranian commander to be killed since the U.S. assassinated the Quds Force leader Qasem Soleimani in Iraq in 2020. Yes, there is the argument that could be made that they shouldn't have been there in the first place, but, Iran then had to retaliate. And I think it was more of a saving face exercise because the salvo involved more than 300 missiles and drones, and the majority of which were intercepted with the help of the US, the UK, France, and Jordan. And, people have said, right, well, we've had a 7-year-old girl that was injured and that was it. And, most of that was kind of batted off. So I think now everyone's saying, well, what is Israel going to do on the back of that? And I think, most people have come to the conclusion to say, we don't want this to escalate any further. A G7 emergency summit was convened, a UN Security Council emergency meeting was convened, and they've said, we've got to de-escalate this because the last thing that the world needs right now is Iran and Israel in a war and dragging the whole Middle East into that. Even Supreme Leader Ayatollah al-Khamenei has made it very clear over the last 6 months of war in Gaza that Iran doesn't wish to be dragged into a wider conflict. Iran's economy and people are already suffering under UN, EU's, US sanctions. Yeah. So you just, you can't.
Look, I disagree with your assessment on Iran. And I think that Israel has no choice. As deterrence is eroded, Israel has to confront Iran. But we're going to...
Well, this is a good way to start, though, in mass disagreement. But I think, to be honest with you,
we'll leave our disagreement for the episode on Iran.
We do have to leave that, but I just have to say that I think that, Israel just needs to leave it alone. We need to de-escalate because they really just need to focus on fighting Hamas because, Iran has already made it very clear Israeli retaliation will be met with even harsher reactions. The U.S. isn't interested in escalation and wants it to stop. And Israel has even said that they just need to focus on the fighting in Hamas. So I think it's like, yes, okay, everybody's had their say. We just need to go back to our corners now and focus on the things that we need to do and de-escalate it. But I mean, it's good to know that our Iran episode is going to be spicy. But anyway, let's move on swiftly before this escalates.
You mentioned Iran, and I know Chris Parry will refer to these, but there are 3 main prisms to view the world geopolitically. And it's quite interesting that Iran actually, in some way, falls in each one of these categories. So, for example, when you had Mahan, who argued that whoever controls the sea controls the world, right? He was basically, at the time, he was saying that it was important for Britain to control the seas, especially at a time when its major European rivals were declining in their relative naval strength. And this would enhance Britain's capacity to create export markets to become a trading power. So it paved the way for Britain to emerge as a dominant political, military, and economic power. And he similarly believed that the US should expand in the same type of manner. Because America required overseas markets. And if you need overseas markets, you need a strong navy to protect and secure those markets. So when you see, for example, the Houthis, Iran's proxies, striking at naval corridors, shipping lanes, they know exactly what they're doing. This is an attempt to hold the international community at ransom. That directly plays into Mahan's argument that whoever controls the sea controls the world. And what I think has been under-spoken about is that when America tells China to lobby Iran to convey to the Houthis to de-escalate, in a sense, it's not only giving Iran the power in the region.
Yeah, it's giving them agency because they're validating them. Yeah.
But it's giving China huge agency in the region. So we see how Iran is playing out there. And you had Mackinder, who offered a second approach, which was whoever controlled the heartland will control the world. And the heartland he spoke about would be consisting of Russia, the former Soviet republics of Central Asia, which are all the stans, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Eastern Europe, which borders that, has the best position in order to use these heartland resources. So we see how Russia it managed to secure Ukraine's agriculture, its crops, its harvest, to hold Ukraine at ransom, because whoever rules Eastern Europe will rule the heartland. And that heartland, according to Mackinder, is the vast area of Central Asia located between the Carpathians in the west and the Hindu Kush Mountains in the south and the Altai Mountains in the east. And in the north, it's surrounded by the Baltic Seas. So that heartland is pretty significant. And in turn, whoever dominates that will rule the world island. So the world island he saw as the largest mass in the world, consisting of Europe, Asia, and Africa, so which over 80% of the global population live in, and it's also has all the world's resources. It's the richest area. And in turn, there's the coastal islands, which he considered Japan and the British Isles, and the periphery islands, which was North America, South America, and Australia. So countries that belong to the coastal and peripheral islands, which we see as quite powerful states, from this geopolitical perspective, is in a weaker position to directly control the heartland. So as to your point of France intervening in Russia, we can see why America or NATO is unwilling to directly engage on Ukraine's behalf. At best, they will be supplying Ukraine with weapons. They don't want to directly engage in the heartland.
No, because if you go back to what Michael Clark said on our previous interviews with him, the U.S. is in a win-win situation. They get to spend about 5% of their defense budget battling Russia with zero risk and zero casualties. They can send weapons, they can send support, they can send aid. They're not directly involved in the conflict. They get to deal with Russia and have that settled on that front and have people fighting on their behalf by providing that aid for 5% of the budget. It's win-win for them. And even though, yes, it's a lot of money for defense equipment and things of that nature, Europe can't provide that or sustain it, so the U.S. has to. And there's no way the U.S. is going to let Russia take over more land and take over more territory and move forward. So they can handle that, and they'll continue to support that. And I think Congress would be crazy not to move forward with that because, yes, okay, it's an outlay, but really in the larger scheme of things, it's not that much of an outlay of cash and or weapons for the United States, and it achieves multiple purposes. It's like two birds with one stone.
You would think that in today's highly technologically advanced age that geography doesn't matter, but actually geography still matters, which is why NATO states don't want to directly get involved on Ukraine's behalf, because in order to successfully invade the heartland, you need to overcome the mountain ranges from the south that protects the heartland and the sea in the north.
I don't think that NATO wants to go and invade the heartland or have control of it. I think they just don't want to get involved in World War III, you know what I mean, in Europe.
But I'm just saying that escalation, which you're referring to, is an obvious point, but I'm just demonstrating why Mackinder's theory to a degree still holds true, in that there is a calculus why the international community doesn't want to get involved, and it's because of geographic impediments to control the heartland.
Well, I think yes, but I mean, the rimland theory holds that the main power belongs to the countries around the edge of Europe and Asia, thus controlling the heartland. But Spikeman was an opponent of the heartland theory. During World War II, strategists, applied his theory with the prevailing opinion that a combined naval and land force in the rimland area could maintain control over the Soviet Union. And in the belt that encompasses rimland, stretching from Far East Asia through Southeast Asia, India, and the Middle East, then Southern and Western Europe, is passing most of the world's goods transit between the sea and land. Right. And Professor Spikeman considered that the control of coastal countries in the sea gives an advantage over the control of the land itself. On the other hand, the critics' argument was that Spikeman didn't take into account air control and nuclear warfare. But going back to the world's good transiting between, these areas, is China developing one belt, one road? Right. And so they will then, I think when it's done, something like 77% of the world's goods will pass through one belt, one road. And that is where China's hegemony comes in. They don't have to rule militarily. They will rule the markets and rule the world that way, because if you've got control over 77% of the goods and products in the world, you don't really need anything else. And that, again, goes into the rimland theory. They will have control of all of that because it runs all the way through those areas.
I would just expand upon that rimland theory. It's kind of at the fault lines between where great civilizations are overlapping, great blocks are overlapping or contesting one another. So, for example, if you look at Ukraine, or you look at the Baltic states, well, they are in between Europe and Russia. If you look at Israel, that's at the fault lines of the Middle East and Europe. If you look at the South China Seas, well, that's a fault line which China is attempting to dominate, in which you're getting contestations from Vietnam and others as China attempts to extend its sphere of influence. So it's just really interesting that what you can see playing out in these rimlands are either proxy warfare, so what you see in southern Lebanon, or you see in Gaza. They're not kind of real states areas. These are areas which Iran attempts to basically take over by funneling huge amounts of weapons and sponsoring Hamas and Hezbollah. You're seeing, in a sense now, Iran attempting to turn Jordan into a rimland as well by fomenting huge amounts of unrest, by attempting to flood it with weapons as well, which threatens the Hashemite kingdom. You're seeing Iran doing that to the West Bank too. So in a sense, not only does it attempt to exploit rimlands, it attempts to create rimlands as well. Which I think is quite significant. And at the same time, you're seeing you can't just rely on any one of these theories. You've got, for example, Iran having a direct strike against Israel from its own territory. That's not, while Israel itself would be a rimland, it's not relying on launching an attack from the rimlands to within the rimlands. So that's why it's an escalation, because it's a direct launch from its own territory. So wherever you see sort of large states, large powers overlapping with one another, that would be considered the rimlands. This would be kind of, the Thucydides trap, where one state is going to eclipse another state. A rising power is going to eclipse an existing power. That would kind of be a rimlands theory applied to great power politics. What Spikeman spoke about in terms of his rimland theory was applied geographically, but you could also apply that in a non-geographic sense to that gray area of when a state is rising and it's going to eclipse a pre-existing great power.
I think we've talked about this several times, that we're moving from a unipolar world to a multipolar world, right? We're going into multipolarity, and I think we're going to see more and more of this. And it will be interesting to see how all of this shakes out. And what are these states that are dying powers and losing hegemony going to be do to fight for their positioning? And how will these rising powers then, come in and take over and create that influence and that persuasion and, that slow overtake of power, or very quickly, depending on how things shake out. But I think before we delve any further into that, I think this is a good time for us to stop talking and let someone else do the talking for a change and move into our guest interview. So we are now honored to have retired British Royal Navy Rear Admiral Christopher Parry, CBE, former NATO commander, and the first chair of the British government's Marine Management Organization join us.
Hi, Chris. Welcome to the show. We're really pleased to have you. I was just hoping you would be able to characterize from your perspective the different geopolitical tensions that exist today. What are the main blocks that you see?
Well, I think over the last 10 years, we've seen the emergence really of two main blocks. We've been forecasting it. They've coalesced, I think, pretty solidly in the last 2 or 3 years. And I think we'll start with what I would call the Eurasian autocrats, which is Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. It's quite clear that in economic and political terms, they've been aligning. I think the start of it probably was the 2015 oil and gas deal between China and Russia, which enabled Putin to access $560 billion up to 2048 in exchange for as much oil and gas as China could absorb. And I think that formed the basis with the relationship between China and Iran for a tripartite arrangement. And I think in the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen North Korea move into that grouping as well. Now, almost by accident rather than design, we've seen what I would call the maritime democracies coming together, which I would say are Canada, United States, parts of Europe, not all of it, United Kingdom, obviously, Japan's, Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, and I think within 5 years, probably India, given its geopolitical orientation and interests. And that leaves between those two blocks about 150 what I call in-betweeners. And those in-betweeners are trying to sort out with their elites where their allegiance needs to go, either towards the Eurasian autocrats or to the maritime democracies. And it seems to me that those that are interested in development are flopping towards the Eurasian autocrats, whereas those who are really worried about their security are tending towards the maritime democracies. Now, that's not to say that quite a lot of other countries, of course, are operating by sitting on the fence and trying to exploit both aspects and also playing at different levels. So you've got the likes of Brazil, for example, engaged with the BRICS, which are heavily involved, as you know, with China and Russia. And you've got Saudi Arabia, terrified, of course, of an Iranian nuclear device in 2025 or sometime around that, trying to play both the United States and China together. So it's a complex pattern, but actually one that's got discernible features, I would suggest.
I'm really interested in what you're saying about the in-betweeners that appear to be constantly shifting between two spheres of influence, almost even capricious. I remember I spoke to you in the past, I think you're also a huge Godfather fan, and I characterized it as Fredo banging cocktail waitresses two at a time. Are you able to just expand upon how you see them shifting? Is it in a regulatory manner that they seek greater economic ties with the East and defense and security ties with the West? How is it that you'll see them being in between? How will that play out? Because during the Cold War, it was kind of very identifiable what were the different spheres of influence. It seems to be less identifiable today.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that reflects that we're in a contested but also a connected world nowadays. And that actually makes it very different from the original Cold War. But I always say we're in a Palmerstonian world because Palmerston, as you're both well aware, I'm sure, said quite clearly, countries don't actually have permanent friends. They don't have permanent enemies. They have permanent interests, and it's their duty to follow those interests. And I think that's what elites in these countries are doing right now. They're following essentially what will give them legitimacy with their own people, whether that's delivering economic benefit or security. What we've seen progressively, I think, since probably about the turn of the century is the construction of an alternative ideology by the Eurasian autocrats, which says, look, we don't really care about democracy and human rights. Most of our people are interested in stability, security, and prosperity. So all these sort of universal values that the free world or the West actually espouses, we're not really interested in that. And so we're seeing a lot more controlled economies, centrally managed economies. We're seeing centrally managed data and human systems operating there. And it's a direct challenge. But what I think is interesting about the Eurasian autocrats is they are all under pressure, one way or the other. Russia, of course, is under pressure because of an economy that depends simply on energy. It's involved in Ukraine. It has a criminal organization that poses as a government that is projecting in all sorts of directions. You've got China essentially on the decline, as I believe, economically, demographically, and a host of other problems that give it pause. I think in North Korea, you've got a succession crisis coming up soon in relation to Kim Jong-un. He's not well. And of course, Iran is terrified of a population that 70% of which are under 35, who don't actually want to live under a theocracy. And all of them are saying, look, the existential threat to us is Western or free world values.
But in a contested but connected world, could you just give an example of how you see these certain countries shifting between two spheres of influence? Could you just expand upon that?
Well, most of them are trying to sit on the fence at the moment. If you look at Saudi Arabia depends critically on the United States for its strategic defense and quite a lot of its diplomatic muscle as well. But you've got a situation recently where, of course, Saudi Arabia says, look, Iran right now is feeling insecure. It's heading for a nuclear device. It could get unstable. How are we going to guarantee our security in future? Well, the Americans may not be there for us. So what they've done is said, look, China and Iran are really close together. They have been for about 30 years. As long as we get China on side, China will keep Iran off our backs. And to my mind, that is at the root of the recent sort of accord that suddenly sprung up between two countries that are both confessionally and strategically at odds with each other. So you see an accommodation taking place there. I mean, you look at Vietnam, another one, essentially one you might think would be aligned with the Eurasian autocrats. But actually, its interests really lie in coming in with the maritime democracies because it's concerned about China. China's concerned about Vietnam. Vietnam sucking away medium and low paid jobs away from China. They don't like China being all over their economic zone in the South and East China Sea. So you're seeing very odd bedfellows here at the moment. They are alliances of convenience. And as I said, people say, what does the political compass look like? I say, well, it's constantly spinning around at the moment. And that'll be the case for quite some time to come. But we shouldn't be any doubt that these Eurasian autocrats are pushing out in their areas at the moment. And between them, I believe they want to dominate the Eurasian continent and the waters around it. One thing you see in Russian and Mandarin literature all the time at the moment is they want to de-Americanize the world and its institutions. And part of that, as I said, is dominating the Eurasian continent and the waters around it to exclude the Americans, both in economic and strategic terms.
So, Chris, I kind of just want to expound on that because you were talking about the world at large shifting from unipolarity to multipolarity. And, it's interesting that the timing that we saw is that, right around the time that Saudi Arabia is starting to normalize ties after we've already had the Abrahamic Accords with Israel. Then you have, the U.S. administration releasing $6 billion back to Iran. And then suddenly you see this attack on Israel on October 7th, and you see more and more funding from Iran of Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis, and the disruption that the Houthis are causing to supply chains across the world and how this is sort of spreading. But, on several, shows that we've actually spoken about, we've seen that, Russia has gone into the Ukraine, and there's the theory that this is a distraction for China and Iran to start making moves. And there's been some people talking about how, with all of this distraction, with the Western coalition and NATO being spread so thin, that China will probably now make a move on Taiwan, and Iran is now making moves as well. So I guess I have a 2 or 3 part question for you, in that why is it not, in your opinion, not in Iran's interest for a united Middle East and for Saudi Arabia to create normalization of ties with Israel? And what do you think that China's next move is? And do you think it will be a strike against Taiwan? And what will be the global impacts of that? So it's a very loaded question. Sorry.
No, so some interesting questions there. No, I mean, everything in these autocratic regimes is about regime survival. And so every single geopolitical choice they make is about that. You know, when I used to talk to Chinese academics, they said every decision that is made by the permanent Politburo here is about 2 things. One is regime survival, and second is social stability. Nothing else counts. So the way I interpret their actions at the moment is in the same way as you read in 1984. If you've got internal problems, you externalize them. So you project outwards. And I genuinely think that all 4 regimes feel vulnerable at the moment. So they're pushing outwards very aggressively in their respective regions. As I said earlier, Russia's pushing on to Western Europe through Ukraine. Iran is using its proxies, as you say, Leah, to actually destabilize the Middle East, but particularly to focus on Israel, because it knows that it can garner support both amongst Persians and Arabs in that respect. If you look at China, it's very aggressive, out of sight in the South and East China Sea at the moment, in a very grey zone sort of way. And I anticipate this year North Korea will be very belligerent towards South Korea. I think that's something that's about to happen. Of course, we're spread very thin, but that's because the free world hasn't really come together. It leans on the United States all the time to make the first move. And I think we're seeing in Europe now that people are starting to get it, that actually we can't leave it to the United States. I've said for a long time now, for about 10 years, since Robert Gates started to talk about how much the United States subsidizes NATO, the fact that in the past, the Americans, whenever there was a problem in the world, would say, look, we're going to form a posse, and we're going to hand out the deputies' badges. You and I call it a coalition. We go and sort it out, and then we go back again. Well, what the Americans are saying now is, unless you actually invest in your own defense and security in Europe, in the Middle East, or in the Asia Pacific, that posse ain't going to be formed. But if you do invest in your own defense, we will send the cavalry. And that seems to be the deal now. The United States implicitly is putting out there. And that's a bipartisan approach that I detect inside the Beltway. It doesn't matter if it's Democrat or Republican, Trump, Biden, or anybody else. That is the way the Americans see the world at the moment. They're fed up with us freeloading on them. I was talking to some people in Europe only last week, and I said, do you realize how much it would cost to actually get our defenses up to a level where we could resist and deter Russia without the Americans? And nobody really had a clue, but the answer is about 460 billion euros. And everybody went, crikey, how on earth can anybody afford that? And I said, look, just think about it. That is half the annual American defense budget. And you're saying you can't afford it. And you can see why the Americans would get very cynical about all this in the modern age. And so my view on all of this is the free world has got to get its act together. I mean, let's go back to your point about the sea and the Houthis and everything. Well, if you put together all the free world navies, we've got 1,000 warships, which easily outplays anything the other side has got. We've just got to bring it together and actually say, let's think about it. If the Eurasian autocrats are dominating the world island, as Mackinder used to call it in geopolitical terms, then the maritime democracies have got to dominate the world ocean, because that's the link between commodities, manufacturers, markets. And in history, maritime alliances have always defeated continental alliances for that reason. So we've just got to get our strategic act together. We've got to get our people behind this to say, look, we are in real danger from autocratic regimes that almost replicate the fascist and communist menace that we had in the 30s. It's that scale now. And if you look at Mein Kampf, Hitler's big work, and everybody forgets there's a second book as well. He said, look, if you can dominate the Eurasian heartland, then you can dominate the world. Well, that's the agenda, boys and girls. We have to get used to that. So your last point, Leah, Taiwan. I don't think that China will move on Taiwan. They want Taiwan to drop into their lap, frankly, either through the population saying, yeah, we want to be part of a success story called China, or it becomes so isolated from the rest of the free world that everybody says, well, crikey, it's not worth fighting for anymore. So that's what they're relying on. My own view is that they will move against Taiwan by 2035. And the reason I mention that date is that Xi Jinping idolizes Mao Zedong. And everything he's done with the party, everything he's done with the country since he's been in power has reflected what Mao thought. He even quotes Mao in his speeches. And the critical thing is that in 2035, Xi Jinping will be the same age as Mao when he dies. And I think he will want Taiwan on his legacy before he dies. And so I'm focused on them thinking that 2035 would be the time when they would actually take more vigorous action. Having said that, I think we'll have a transition in China before then, because I think the problems will be too great.
Now, how do you think this is going to actually affect One Belt, One Road? This is a massive multi-trillion-dollar project by China in an effort to basically own trade lines and shipping lanes across the world. And surely this shift in polarity within the immediate region around them, the Middle East, and then, what's happening across the world, surely that has to be affecting One Belt, One Road. And what impact does that have not only on China, but on the region, do you think?
Well, I think China will dominate the greater Middle East within the next decade. Part of it will be the Belt and Road Initiative. I agree with that. But I think more of it will be where the countries see their interests lying. I'll give you a Black Swan-y wild card now. And I think that the player that will step forward to reconstruct and also provide peacekeepers to Gaza when all this is over will be China. And that will be part of them planting their feet on the ground and saying, okay, this is where the Belt and Road Initiative comes together. I remember about a dozen years ago, Assad in Syria saying, look, we're on the junction of four seas here. And if we're able to create this Shia corridor that goes through Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, China can punch out into the Eastern Mediterranean here. So I think, my own view is watch out for China saying, we'll take on this. We've got lots of construction capacity. We've got lots of money we can spend, and they'll be on the ground. And let's not forget, the greatest number of peacekeepers in the world in the last 10 years has been from China. So that's my wild card.
I mean,
do you think that the Americans would accept that? Do you think that they would allow them to have that kind of agency in Israel?
Leah, forgive me, but right now, the United States is not being the United States that I'm used to.
That's true.
I love the country, and I think it is freedom's best choice. I really do. But right now, it's being very sclerotic, and it doesn't seem to have statesmanship of the order that I've been used to studying in the 1950s and 1960s. I'm one of those that believes that we could have a situation in November, for example, where neither Trump or Biden are actually running as the candidates, the way things are going at the moment. So until I'm always very optimistic about the United States, because when you have very high levels of income inequality in America's history, and forgive me for talking about your own history here, if you look at the 1830s, you look at the 1850s, 1890s, 1930s, you always have this polarization of politics and all the identity and other issues flying out. But America's like Madonna, it reinvents itself really well.
She's not doing a great job recently, I have to say.
Now, yeah, maybe that's a good reflection on the way America is at the moment. Yeah.
They're symbiotic. They're exactly the same. So they're going through the same issues.
So the analogy is not great, but America, it will shake itself together. It's a continental superpower. It is absolutely founded on some of the best principles that mankind has ever put together. And it'll come back.
Chris, what people often forget is they look at regional disruptors such as Iran and such as Russia, and they see them as fomenting unrest. But what they often forget is that such actors seek to inevitably extend their spheres of influence. So Russia naturally would want to extend its sphere of influence into the Balkans, disrupt Finland, Sweden, Western Europe. Iran wants to have its Shia arc across the Middle East. And, as Leah spoke beforehand about China's Belt Road Initiative, that's all about a form of extending a sphere of influence. Now, when you speak about the Eurasian autocratic bloc, you've mentioned in the past that it confronts the West in gaps between the two blocs. So these gaps or where it can extend its sphere of influence through different malicious means. Could you expand upon the gaps that you identify?
Okay, so a couple of things there, Barak. First of all, if you look at Russia, China, and Iran, these are basically imperial impulses. So the expansion you're talking about is Russia trying to extend to where Catherine the Great used to be. And it's no coincidence that in the early days of the war in Ukraine, Putin was giving speeches in front of statues of Catherine the Great. So every Russian knew exactly what the agenda was in that regard. But Ukraine is the old province of New Russia under Catherine the Great. So look at Iran. No Arab, and you'll know this, Leah, in the Middle East calls them Iranians. They call them Persians. For a very good reason, because the Iranians have an imperial approach to the way things are. If you look at life before 1979, the Pahlavi regime was consciously projecting a neo-imperial agenda. That's why it procured rather large warships that could operate down past the east coast of Africa and places like that. So let's go to China. China is simply recreating the Ming Dynasty strategy of the 15th century by land and by sea. It's promoting the old Silk Roads, pipelines, roads, railways across Eurasia to Europe and the Middle East. It's reviving the sea routes that Zheng Ho both promoted and protected. And the Belt and Road is simply the Ming laydown that existed then. Why is that? Because China's GDP was 1.5 times that of the rest of the world, and it's referred to constantly in Chinese propaganda and literature right now that that's where they want to be. So it's no surprise. These are imperial powers. Now, if you go back to classic geopolitics here, Halford Mackinder, you'll be familiar with, said, look, if you dominate the world island, Eurasia, then you dominate the world. But Mahan, on the other hand, said, no. He agreed with me that if you dominate the world ocean, you dominate the world. Now, there's a third geopolitician that nobody ever mentions called Nicholas Spikeman. And he says, actually, between these two blocks, the world ocean and the world island, there's rimland. And this is where all the fights are going to be and where all the tension, all the expansion from both blocks is going to take place. And if you look at the world today, Ukraine, Israel, South China Sea, all these other places are rimland. They are the bits around the Eurasian continent where you're in direct conflict and contact with your opposing blocks. So those seismic frictions are going to create the proxy wars, the direct wars, the confrontations, all the competition that we're going to see in our connected but contested world.
Why did the West allow them to become gaps? And you have also mentioned in the past the free world that dominates the sea is equivalent to the World Wide Web, and that if you don't control the sea, you can't benefit from globalization. So if you could expand upon that concept, and in this kind of World Wide Web, globalization, domination of the sea, how could the West have allowed there to have been a gap in the so-called World Wide Web for the Eurasian autocrats to exploit?
Well, I'm going to fair and square blame the Clinton administration for this, for allowing the Chinese into the World Trade Organization to benefit from globalization without actually investing in the security and other arrangements that come with it. It's down to complacency and judging people by your own standards. I referred earlier to the fact we don't have any statesmen anymore. We did have a statesman called Kissinger once, and he's part of the problem because he brought China into the world in 1972 and throughout his life, I'm afraid, projected China as a cooperative rather than a confrontational power. So we've had real naivety, complacency, but I think we've had a series of crises that have delegitimized the Western model. It starts in 2008 with the financial crash, where it enabled China really to be able to say, look, we've got an alternative model that actually protects you from this. We then got operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, which I'm afraid delegitimized intervention by free world countries. And effectively, we've lost Iraq and Afghanistan to the Eurasian autocrats as a result. And I think since then, COVID is another thing which has delegitimized governments in the free world. They're not capable of dealing with strategic issues and are perceived not to be able to deal with it. Now, I'm not a great fan, forgive me, of Barack Obama, whose strategic inaction has created all the crises that we're talking about today. Let's just look at it, okay? 2014, you have 3 US warships in the Black Sea when the Russians moved against Ukraine. They could have been moved within sight of Sevastopol and Crimea. They weren't. They went nowhere near it. There was no sort of scaling up of NATO's alert state. So Putin was given the message, carry on and do what you like. Let's look at the greater Middle East. If you use chemical weapons in Syria, that's a red line. Oh, no, it isn't. Suddenly, it's not a red line. Okay, fine. I know I can just carry on and do what I like. And let's see when he was assured by Xi Jinping that they wouldn't fortify those artificial reefs and islands in the South China Sea. He was assured by Xi Jinping that would never happen. And lo and behold, it's happened. And with regard to North Korea, we see appeasement all the way through the Obama presidency with regard to the development of missiles and also nuclear technology as well. You know, you can't show this level of weakness and appeasement and expect dictators not to take advantage of that. And it may seem very brutal to say that, but with President Obama, we have the seeds of all the crises that we have today in these rimland areas.
No, I agree with you completely, Chris. And I think the U.S. has not been a good ally since the 60s or 70s. And we've seen a decline in their power since that time. It's gotten more prevalent through like the last few decades. And I couldn't agree with you more on there being a lack of statesmen. And I think that's on both sides of the pond. I think we have houses full of politicians. We do not have anybody who's in the interest of the state. They've become personalized agendas, not interested in geopolitics, just simply interested in their own backyards.
Why do you think, though, that level of statesmanship has declined, right? You know, once upon a time, you could have this massive figure like Kissinger that may have been part of the problem, but he was still an intellectual powerhouse. Why do you have such mediocrity today?
I think because we've seen a greater divide. We have 2 major parties. We don't have a 3-party system anymore in the U.S. And I think that they've just been allowed to get further and further away from each other. And nobody's there to check and balance them.
This seems to be an international phenomenon. You know, you see it here and you see it in Europe. Chris, what do you think?
Well, look, I mean, I'm afraid it's the fault of electoral politics. If you are inviting people to be re-elected periodically, either every 2, 4 or 5 years, that's going to be their focus. Whenever I speak to politicians in the UK about strategic issues, they're not interested.
That was always the case, Chris.
No, do you know what, Barack? I'm not sure that's true. If you look at some of our Victorian statesmen in Britain in the 19th century, classically, you've got Robert Peel saying, look, for the good of the country, we've got to repeal the Corn Laws. And everybody in the cabinet said, look, we're going to lose the next election if you do that. And Peel said, no, I know that, but for the good of the country, we've got to do it. They repeal the Corn Laws, they lose the election, but British trade quadruples over the next 30 years. You know, so you've got that. Part of it is to do with the franchise. And this is going to sound really odd, but if you look at the 18th century, when Britain was expanding its empire and things like that, you know, the franchise was limited to the 40 shilling freeholders, as they call. Now, what was important was that most of the taxes were on land and property. And the deal was, look, you know, we're going to get involved in India. And I'm simplifying. We need to deal with the French. We need to do all sorts of things. So we're going to put a 3/16 tax on property. And everyone went, that's outrageous. You can't possibly do that. But they said, if we are successful in India, those taxes will reduce to 1/16, and here are the benefits. Now, that's how a power deals with things strategically. Right now, we are beset by agendas that Ukrainians understand, but our electorates don't. When I talk to Ukrainians today, they say the most important thing in our lives is defense. And I say, okay, why is that, apart from the obvious? And they say, because we can't make decisions about anything else unless we get our defense right. So whenever people say to me, we should be spending more on hospitals, schools, and migrants, I say, look, you don't get to make choices about that if the missiles are landing in Kent rather than Kiev. But there's another point as well. Most of the people that we've been talking about in the 50s and 60s had experience of catastrophic conflict, either the First or the Second World War. Most of the politicians that were in place when I grew up, for example, most of my teachers had served in the military in World War II. They knew what strategic survival depended on. We've got fat, we've got complacent.
Yeah, I was going to say, we've got fat and stupid.
No, well, I think if you look at Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, you can see exactly what the problem is. He talks about immoderate greatness and strategic overstretch. And basically, the discipline and also the values that actually grew the Roman Empire were then turned against them in terms of decadence. And he was quite honest about, the savage tribes of the world, as he called it, being a real threat to civilization.
But something that we do have in our favor, and you've mentioned this a number of times, and I think it's really important for you to expand upon this, is how the free world dominates the sea that's equivalent to the World Wide Web, and that enables us to benefit and drive globalization. Can you expand upon this, Chris?
Yeah, I wrote a book in 2014 called Superhighway, and the basic premise of it was that the sea is the physical equivalent of the World Wide Web. And what brings it closer together, of course, is most of the cables that carry the internet are subsea cables. And frankly, if you are able to dominate the sea, the link between commodities, manufacturers, and markets, then you are going to dominate the process of globalization. Now, what makes it rather sort of complicated nowadays is that the countries that are trying to close down the internet for free use, Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, are the very same ones that are trying to close down freedom of navigation throughout the world's oceans. Now, the other slight complication on top of that is that we're breaking down into what I call a two-block globalized model, where you're going to see Russia, China, Iran, and friends trading within their own group. In fact, Eurasia is a very tight, compact energy and economic ecosystem. And you're going to see the free world trading amongst themselves. And you're seeing this in the way we're de-risking, decoupling from China and divesting away from Russian oil and gas. And even on the other side, you're seeing China with its Made in China 2025 plan, which I think is probably Made in China 2030 at the moment, saying, look, by 2030, we are going to be the world leader in 12 top technologies and industries, from agriculture through to artificial intelligence and aviation. But the small print says, and after that, we're not going to buy anything in these categories unless it's made in China. So, the Germans who rely on the Chinese market for selling all their cars are jumping around at the moment. South Korea and Japan will be in the same bracket, but we're going to see essentially two hemispheres in economic, political, and strategic terms trading internally. And you've only got to look at the sensitivities. Russia's not just interested in Ukraine for the population, the land, and the strategic dominance of the Black Sea. You've got enough oil and gas offshore from Crimea and in the eastern Donbass to displace Russia as the primary supplier of gas to Europe. And it's the same in the eastern Mediterranean. If you look at the Polyphemus and Leviathan fields, you develop those, there's enough gas there to displace Russia as a supplier. So Russia is looking at its foreign exchange declining rapidly if these areas aren't interfered with. I remember Putin was asked why he was in Syria on Russian TV, and I speak Russian. And he said, oh, yeah, we're there because, we want to support a friendly ally. We also don't want a lot of terrorists coming back from Islamic State to Russia. But he said, with regard to the Eastern Mediterranean, if we're not at the table, we'll be on the menu. And that's exactly. And it translates really well out of the Russian, too. So, you can see that there are things going on here that relate to how the world is breaking down into two globalized models, I believe, and the interactions between the two are going to be where the conflict, the confrontation, and indeed cooperation is going to take place. Because I've said to a lot of British manufacturers, in this new world, you're going to have to cooperate where you can, but you're going to have to compete and confront where you must. And I think that's the shape of the world.
With the threats that you are expanding upon, that the West isn't coming to grips with, despite having the domination of the seas and the World Wide Web, which, by the way, there's a reason why the Houthis actually were cutting cables that would connect. Dubai sees it, so the UAE sees itself as a central node, as a trading hub in between different markets at that intersection, and then the Houthis are attempting to undermine it. But when the West is dominating this naval capacity, all the while we're slashing our military expenditure. What do you make of that?
Well, I mean, it's an obvious strategy, isn't it? If you feel secure in Eurasia, I mean, Iran, North Korea, China, and Russia feel they're safe from any sort of invasion or intervention in Eurasia, they can project into the world ocean. And if you're a maritime alliance or a maritime grouping, you're going to be vulnerable at sea. So you've got Russia destabilizing the Black Sea. You've got the Houthis and the Iranians either threatening or actually pushing on to the Red Sea and the Gulf of Oman, Straits of Hormuz. And you've got China all over the South and East China Sea. So you can see that they're actually pushing into our space, if you like, if we are a maritime alliance. Now, the big problem for us is that we have seen China, Russia, and Iran and North Korea, both in nuclear and conventional terms, rearm over the last 15 years. And we have assumed an effortless superiority that we think will deter and defeat those threats. Well, the fact of life is we haven't faced those threats at all. And if you look at the way our weapon stocks and our logistics have been reduced, one of the things I complained about in my book in 2014 is that our opponents could actually see the bottom of our locker, both in manpower and in logistic and ammunition terms. That, I'm afraid, has come to pass. Now, that warning was 10 years ago now, and our governments did nothing about it. And I'm afraid to say this is a function of the way democracies operate. They'd much rather be 100% right in retrospect than 80% right in advance of something happening. And that, frankly, is typical of the way the 1930s rolled out. I'm reading a book at the moment. It's called Appeasing Hitler by Tim Bouverie, and it's all about how we staggered into World War II in the Western world. And every page you read essentially could be happening today, both in terms of what people are saying and in terms of the way the dynamics are playing out.
Because European states are not arming themselves in order to contend with Russia. And it doesn't seem as if America wants to have that strategic posture to not only deter countries like Iran or China, but even to defend themselves against it. We just seem to be very wavering in our commitment, whether it be the US or Europe. So if I was Russia, or if I was China, or I was Iran, I'd be perceiving the West as being quite back-footed, which is quite provocative.
Oh, yes. I mean, if you listen to the Israelis, and I have done over decades listen to the Israelis, they say weakness is a provocation to the bad guys. And that's entirely the case with regard to Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. If they see a weakness, it is a provocation to act on their behalf. And I think we have to accept that we're in a situation at the moment where most of our allies in the free world think that the threat is imaginary. It isn't real. It's existential. You and I both know that. but it's almost imaginary because it's not really featured in people's moral and political landscape over the last 70 years. There's this feeling that it can never happen. But you say, well, okay, look how quickly it happened in Ukraine. Look how quickly it's happened in Israel. We have to accept that in the modern world, technology allows people to be able to take very, very big steps that will destabilize sophisticated societies very quickly indeed. My own view about Russia is it doesn't have to invade Western Europe to actually assert its will. It just has to threaten to destroy our infrastructure in the same way that it has done with Ukraine. And people will feel coerced. And the issue for Western Europe in particular is not about whether we're going to be defeated by Russia. It's about whether we can resist Russian coercion and control, merely because they can hold a gun to our heads and say, if you don't behave, we'll blow your brains out. And the thought of actually having a criminal organization being able to impose its will in the guise of a state on our countries is absolute anathema.
Chris, thank you so much. This has been an absolutely fantastic conversation. Yeah, this is amazing. Honestly, you've been incredible.
I'm British and I'm not usually gushing. There's a reason why I love Chris Parry. You are honestly.
No.
I think Barack has a man crush on you, Chris.
No, you don't understand.
Former Q.
No, you've been fantastic. Thank you so much for taking the time. Yeah, it's amazing. Yeah, thank you so much, Chris. So now this moves us into our third segment of what does this mean to you? The real world outcomes and how this affects everyday life. I think that was an extraordinary interview with Chris, and it really puts things into a lot of perspective. So I think kind of bouncing off of the things that he said, what are the real world outcomes? And we touched on some of it in the interviews of shipping channels and lanes and how that's creating cost burdens and increased prices, longer shipping times, the effects that's having on the market. But what are some of these other real world effects and outcomes?
So when I'm looking at these three main geopolitical theories that we spoke about before, Spikeman, Mackinder, and Mahan, I'm seeing risk becoming the norm. Historically, one could have applied a dominant theory to a specific scenario. So World War II wasn't really a world war. You could go to parts of the globe and not really experience it. Today, when you have a convergence of Iran, Russia, China that are challenging the liberal international order, and it's not only great power politics, they're not only directly being confrontational, they're also using proxy warfare. I see risk becoming the norm at a global level. And
well, let me just interrupt you there for a second, Brock. I think that yes, there were parts of the world that you could go into and World War II wasn't really affecting them as opposed to being in the conflict. But I think the fact that most of the world was embroiled in World War definitely had effects on pretty much everyone on the planet as far as, their markets, their shipping, and everything that was happening to them. So even though they may have not been directly involved in the conflict, it certainly had global impact for sure.
I'm not minimizing it. I'm just saying the prevalence of terrorism today, the fact that the international order as we know it is unraveling. It reminds me, you see these seismic shifts that are taking place everywhere. And it reminds me of that Buffalo Springfield song, For What It's Worth. There's something happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. And it's really, really eerie. And that's the sense that I have today. When you've got in play these three titans of international relations theory, I just think ominous times.
Honestly, I'm just shocked at your musical reference because I can't actually even believe that you're reaching back into classic rock. Your references.
That's my natural frame of reference. Classic rock, soul, blues is my frame of reference. I was born too late.
I thought it was just the Godfather soundtrack on repeat.
But it's the same thing. It's the same
It's
thing.
really not the same thing.
Whether it
It's
be
definitely not
look,
the same thing.
whether it be The Godfather that was done before my time, or music before my time, I was born in the wrong era. By the way, that would be a great name for an album, Born Too Late.
There's so many comments that I have to say, but I'm trying to keep this PG. So I'm just going to skip right through that and say that this is a really good time for us to segue into who are the Godfather characters and just let you move on to that train of thought.
The Godfather character that I think today's episode really covers is Fredo, because we're dealing with a grey zone in which countries are caught between two blocks. In a conversation with Chris Parry, he noted that outside the maritime democracies and Eurasian autocrats, there are 152 countries, and their elites will make decisions which direction to veer. An example is Saudi Arabia, that on one hand leans on the US for its security, while economically increasingly relies on China for oil and gas exports as the West goes greener. Despite being reliant on the US for security, at the same time, Saudi Arabia are concerned on Iran's nuclear devices, so are getting closer to China to leverage Iran. Vietnam is naturally drifting towards autocrats as it competes with China with regards to maritime disputes. It's also a new source for low to medium paid jobs. So Vietnam will want to veer towards maritime democracies in the medium to long term. India will veer towards maritime democracies due to its rivalry with China in the Indian Ocean and Asian Pacific. Brian Baltimore, a former lecturer I had at LSE, has noted that ever since we've moved away from a unipolar world, great powers are scrambling for political influence. These naturally include the US, China, Russia, and the EU, which as a collective bloc is coming apart in terms of its capability to project foreign policy and development influence. An example of this is the EU's approach towards Africa, in that it's the former colonial powers such as Britain and France that are able to project foreign policy influence and wield development capabilities on a bilateral level, as opposed to the EU as a multilateral bloc. In that respect, Britain and France are part of the EU bloc, but acting independently of it. Since the Bush administration, the US does not have a cogent strategy vis-à-vis Africa. While African states have no love for Russia or China, they have prejudices for the US seeking to export its LGBTQ social agenda, as democracy has become synonymous with diversity. In turn, developing states are willing to engage with multiple suitors seeking to offer military assistance or infrastructure development. In Africa, Sahel states are so fragile that they will engage with Russia or Russian military contractors to prop up military regimes. China sought to be a debt lender and made it to $1 trillion in developing its Belt Road Initiative. And instead, China became a debt collector. No longer does it offer easy credit terms. An example is Sri Lanka, that had to give up its seaports. Angola is the greatest indebted country in Africa to China. So China has a debt moratorium, which was called to pay back the loans. As a result of that, when you look at African countries, such as Angola, or you go as far out as Sri Lanka, albeit not an African state, they are dependent on China, but really don't want to be a part of China's sphere of influence. They would be more westward orientated, but at the same time are resisting the US's culture that it's projecting abroad. So I think this is indicative of a huge gray zone in which states are operating in.
Okay, well, that is it for us today. Please make sure to tune in next week for our episode, which will be taking an in-depth look at Iran, what this means to the region, the world at large, and you.
The GeoGodfather Wars is an Electricast production. Our executive producers are Leah Tedrow, Barak Seener, Mark Netter, and Peter Rafelson. If you like our podcast, please rate, review, and tell your friends and colleagues to listen in.
Hey guys, it's Miriam Love here, and I want to share something very special with you. Check out my new release, All In, the Spanish remixes, out now on Electric House Records. And always remember, be love, share love, all love.
Available now wherever you listen to music.
Ever thought about starting your own podcast?
Do you have a business or a message you want to share with the world?
Well, now it's easier than ever with Electricast. Hi, I'm Mark Netter.
And I'm Peter Rafelson. We're the founders of Electricast Media.
Whether you want to start a new podcast or already have one, join Electricast to grow your audience, monetize your content, and build your community.
With our simple sign-up, you get free promotion, world-class analytics, premium ads, and personal support.
Go to electricast.com and join our community today.
Electricast. Transform your influence.
Electricast. Electricast.